Okay, comrades. So this is the last. Well, I'm going to do one more talk, which will be to summarize. To try to draw everything together from the whole series. But so this is like the last talk of this particular series, and I'm going to take it up. It's really come up to present. I'm going to really deal with what I've called the degenerated social monarchy. That's a term I'm going to use. So I'm going to go into that. So if I just move on my slides a second to tell you, I'm going to, this is my introduction. I'm then going to talk about this crisis of democracy that we're already talking about. Talk about this idea of what is degeneration, what might that mean, a degenerated state. Then to talk about this degenerated social monarchy from 2008 to 2019. I've stopped at 2019 at the general election because I would want to say that next time I'll set you some homework, and you set your homework. What happened since 2019? What happened since the general election? Obviously, the argument would be to what extent does the COVID crisis that we've had prove or disprove this idea of a degenerated social monarchy? You know, so that's what I really want to think about. So we'll see what we can see from that process. So I'm going up then to come to an end at the 2009 general election. I'm going to skip the next one. I did have some reading here, but I won't waste time on that. I was going to put some reading up. I did find a very interesting book in English history by a guy called Robert Toombs, Professor Robert Toombs. And it was the book of the year. I'll put that up if people want to read it. It is an excellent book. And he's not a left-winger, he's not a socialist, but his history book is full of detail. So you can get the whole post-war history. Well, actually go back to, I don't know when it goes back to 1066, but I was just looking at the last couple of chapters. And it's a very detailed story. So if you want to find any events happening, he didn't have the Occupy movement in it when he's talked about this period, but it's very useful. He's a Brexit supporter, by the way. So he's more on the right, but the history is very useful. It was the book of the year about a year or so ago. So I'll put that up for people who want to. I'm also referencing Beyond Brexit by Vernon Bogdanov, sorry, and also the health report, what's called the Marmot report. It's a health report that came out, there's just one. And there's also a piece by Leopold, I'm just trying to remember his name, but hang on a minute. It's the one that Marie and George are looking at, the person Marie and George are looking at. And I did promise I'd circulate it, but I will do afterwards. I think his name is Bruno Leopold. That's who it is. But he also wrote a bit called Crisis of Democracy and what Marx has to say about it. So I will circulate that because I've got it in a file. So I will put these references up because so I'll add to this little list I've got there. Okay, I'll add to that little list before I send the PowerPoints out. So I'll tweak the PowerPoints at the end and send them around to comrades. So the first thing I wanted to do is just to remind ourselves about this concept of the social monarchy. And it is a very complicated diagram, but it's not that complicated really, but I'll try to put it into a great, think of it as a big cake, okay? There's this massive sort of cake. And at the bottom layer of this cake, you've got this mixed economy. This is, we're talking about 1945. We're talking about the social monarchy in the post-war period. We've got the mixed economy. We've got National Coal, British Rail, all these other things. We've got the private sector, of course. And that was about 15% of the economy, maybe as high as 20, but it's like a mixed economy. Then you've got what we might call social services of different kinds: education, housing, health and social care. NHS is in there, public transport, pensions and other things. It's not meant to be an exclusive list. Those are the things that give substance to the idea of a social monarchy. But then above that, you've got the fact that we're living in different nations within this. So we've got England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales. So the people are in the different nations. And then we all elect people to this union parliament, the Westminster Parliament. At this stage, there's no Scottish Assembly, Welsh Assembly, any of those things. We haven't got there yet. They didn't exist. There's only one central parliament. And then above all of that is the crown. And I've done the crown as being the civil service. The treasury is absolutely crucial, where Jennifer nearly got a job. And the armed forces and other such things. We could fill a lot of things in there. The crown is the kind of state. So it's a very powerful body. And then at the top, we've got the Queen waving at us. But we're deliberately not confusing the Queen with the crown in this point. The Queen is symbolic. We could symbolize the social monarchy as the Queen, the BBC, and the NHS. There we are. That's the three sort of icons of the social monarchy. BBC, Queen, I think BBC, NHS, and the Queen. And then we got a little Union flag at the top, etc., etc. So that was the model that we had. And then the next bit was to do a kind of, timeline of this social monarchy. So I'm only reviewing what we've already discussed. So I've got the spirit of 45. I've got born in that decade, although we could trace it back to the First World War, as I mentioned before, because it was already appearing before the Second World War. But anyway, born in that decade, the Labour government, 1945. Then we've got what might be called the golden age of the social monarchy between 50, when the economy grew, right up to 1979. In France, for example, Marie, it's the Trente Glorieuses. I know you probably know that, Trente Glorieuses. Well, we had our own Trente Glorieuses, I suppose, when things seemed to be going well. And then, of course, towards the end of this period, it all starts to go wrong. Northern Ireland, I suppose, are those people who never got the Catholic population of Northern Ireland probably never got the kind of real benefits, what might have been the benefits of the social monarchy, but they were started to rebel against that. We had the miners' strike at the end of this period, 2 miners' strikes. Then we have this period of crisis. Then we have the oil crisis, 1974, which is quite a big turning point. That takes us through the winter of discontent. Then I think we start to go into the social monarchy in decline under Thatcherism, beginning with Thatcher, the miners' strike, and we could mention, for example, the printers' strike, the steelworker, other strikes where workers were defeated. Larry could tell us some stuff about that, which, of course, also gives rise to New Labour. I mean, because the miners are defeated, the working class movements also suffers defeats. Then it's into that vacuum comes Tony Blair and New Labour. So we go right the way up to 2008. We're in decline. The social monarchy is shrinking. It's being, if you look back to the original diagram, it's being privatized. The welfare state is being changed and all those other things going on. And then in the last one that we've got here, I'm calling this the period where we've gone from decline, 2008 with the banking crisis, to a period of degeneration. So I'm just talking this time about this last stage of this rise and fall, if you like, of the social monarchy. Okay, the social monarchy being the constitutional monarchy and being the welfare state that some people call a social democracy. If you don't use the word monarchy, people call it a kind of social democracy, because democracy is a nicer thing to call it than a monarchy. But it doesn't mean the Queen, it means the constitutional monarchy. So that's where I'm kind of focusing on this period from 2008, the last bit, to 2021, although I'm only going to come up to 2019 for reasons I said before. To understand this period, I'm going to argue that we need to think of this idea of the crisis of democracy that we began discussing, and comrades had lots of different points, all of which I think really true, shed light on that. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the crisis of democracy. So this is my first new point, and it's a kind of theoretical point, that we need the crisis of democracy to understand this degenerate stage of what's happening to us. So this is the crisis of democracy. And we can say, this is the first of these little things I'm going to talk about here. Moving this over, sorry, I've got to see myself so I can see what I've written there. That's better. The crisis of democracy, there's a lot of literature out there about the crisis of democracy. If you start Googling it, you'll see lots of academics written about it. Professor A.C. Grayling wrote about democracy in crisis. There's quite a bit of it anyway, but the general idea is that popular and mass support declines or is lost. And there's a loss of trust and confidence in the state and the way it works. Now, that doesn't sound very dangerous, just we lost a bit of confidence, but none of us have had any confidence in it as socialists anyway, for the first point. But I'm talking about more broadly amongst people a loss of trust and confidence in the state. And I believe we can see that happening under our noses. We have seen that happening. It can come about through an economic crisis, like a recession, for example. People start to think the state's not really sorting it out or something. Or a war, of course, classically. If a war, people think, you know what, the people who are running this country, they're really not doing it for our benefit. So there are lots of ways, political, economic, social, that the population begins to lose confidence in a significant way. So that's the first part of it, this loss of trust and confidence. We don't believe it. It's like we don't believe in it anymore. You know, so again, as socialists, we don't believe it anyway. But I mean, for a lot of people, that's a different thing. Now, democracy, I think, in this context, obviously means a liberal democracy like America or Spain. But I think we can use the concept of democracy in this sense, broader than that. We could include in our crisis of democracy what I might call a sort of authoritarian democracies, like you have in Russia and Turkey, where the people have the right to vote, but they're almost one-party states almost. So you might say they're quite authoritarian. You know, you could talk about what's happening in Poland and Hungary. I think you could even go to military dictatorships like in Myanmar, which you could say, well, how are they having a crisis of democracy? They're not even a democracy. But in a certain sense, Aung San Suu Kyi, I can't get her name right, but she was ousted and so on. There was a military coup. So it can happen more or less in any state, this lack of trust in the system. By crisis, I think, means, the term crisis means a transitional period, a period perhaps of paralysis, where we've almost as if contradictory, as if some people think we got too much democracy and that's messing everything up. And other people think we haven't got enough of it. So there are people going in different directions with this. A classic example of a crisis of democracy would be the Weimar Republic in 1930, 31, 32. There you've got a republic. People have lost confidence in it because of the world crisis of capitalism. The mass fascist party, mass communist party, etc., in contest. So the Weimar Republic becomes very unstable in this period. How's it going to end up? What's going to happen? Well, we know what did happen. The crisis of democracy was resolved by ending democracy, by going from the Weimar Republic to the Third Reich. That's what happened. There's the process. There's our crisis of democracy. The ruling class in Germany thought there's too much democracy. You know, the Weimar Republic's giving too much. The socialist movement thought we're not getting enough of it. So there's different things going on. We could talk about Spain in the 1930s. John, when he was talking in our group, also talked about what was happening in the 1930s. So it's happening in lots of places. So I think one could talk about, and I'll just go on to the second one of it. Hold on a second. Oh yeah. So I did a schematic, a sort of slightly schematic thing. Here we might think of it as being a little bit like this. So here we've got the crisis of an existing state or constitution at the top. And in this crisis of democracy, there's a polarization started to take place where the normal politics isn't holding very much. And one arrow points towards authoritarian populism. So as people become disillusioned with the democracy, they turn to more authoritarian kind of populist sort of solutions. And if you continue to go down that route, you're heading in a direction of fascism, because that's dealing with the crisis of democracy by violence, by suppression. But you can also have it going in the opposite direction, where a whole section of populace say we need democratic reform, that the present democracy is not really doing enough. We need to have, for example, proportional representation, reform of the House of Lords. So other people are going in a different direction. They're thinking the system isn't working, but perhaps we should need more democracy. Now, of course, from that idea, the Democratic Republic is more like fascism because it goes outside. The two red lines going down are like the parameters, if you like, of our constitution. So we could have in America, you could have Trump as an authoritarian populist or you could have somebody with demanding democratic, but they're still within the framework of the American Constitution, within the red lines. But Trump, as you saw with Trump, when he went to authoritarian, Trump was an authoritarian populist, but how he went very close in that coup to almost to fascism. You could almost say, we could discuss whether Trump became a fascist, was a fascist or whatever, but he's going in that direction. What he's doing is he's feeding into the crisis of democracy and saying, all the people, all the working class people who voted Trump, is that the system's not taking any notice of you. It's not, can't trust them anymore in Washington, what they're doing. So he's mobilizing that for a right-wing answer to that. And obviously on the left, we are mobilizing, I suppose, in that for a democratic answer to this crisis. Now, you notice I've got PR down there twice. This is just to make a small point, that a democratic reform could be proportional representation, or you could have a republic with proportional representation. They're different kind of arguments. We're arguing as Republicans that we need a republic, and I hope we'll think that PR would be a good idea. But anyway, I don't want to get stuck into that. But we don't want PR to be an alternative to a republic, because that's the case that we want to make. We don't want to go down to thinking that there's some reform that can solve the problem when the problem is much more fundamental than that. And which then leads me on to my next sort of slide, which is basically reactions to the crisis. So we can have constitutional reforms, amendments to the old constitution, like the reform of the House of Lords, like PR, still within the framework of the constitutional monarchy, or the Tories have come up with voter ID. And this is one of the things they're promoting at the moment. So a constitutional reform could be reactionary. It doesn't mean it's going to be progressive in any sense. And the Tories are trying to reform the constitution. They've got plans to reform the constitution because it's not working, as they would see it. Then you could also have a constitutional revolution. Well, a constitutional revolution is where you abolish the old constitution, you scrap it altogether. Now, I mentioned the Weimar Republic when it was replaced with the Third Reich, or when the Tsarist constitution was abolished and they had a democratic republic in Russia in 1917, for example. So again, a constitutional revolution could be fascism. They overthrow the constitution and have a fascist regime. But it could also be a republic, because that's a constitutional revolution as well, because it means we've got a new constitution. And then the last point is just to sort of on this, and then we'll leave this apart. I haven't mentioned the democratic deficit, as I said to Jennifer, it went missing, but it fits into this story, that the democratic deficit is part of the crisis of democracy, the loss of confidence in it. So we could slot that in. A constitutional revolution, therefore, could be a military coup or a fascist takeover. Or it could be a democratic revolution, i.e. a democratic revolution where you have a constitutional revolution coming from below. If it comes from below, from the people, that is also a kind of constitutional and democratic revolution. There are lots of examples in history of this, not least the French Revolution, for example. And when you're getting something coming from below, if we look back in history, you'll often get a provisional government of some kind, and you will get obviously a constituent assembly. So if you see a country with a constituent assembly being called a parliament, a special parliament to discuss the constitution. So if you get that, there's a democratic revolution taking place, as there was in Russia in 1917, as there was in France, for example, and so on and so forth. So the crisis of democracy can go in different directions. You can go one way or another. There's no answer. It's a question of the class struggle will decide which direction, how it will pan out. But republicanism comes on the idea of a constitutional revolution or even a democratic revolution. It has to come from the people. It can't come from somebody saying, well, we'll get rid of the Queen and call it a republic, because there wouldn't be a real democratic revolution. So it has to involve people. It has to involve the working class, because the working class is the major part of the people in this country, for example. If it was Russia, the peasants were the major part. Right, okay. So I think we need a concept of crisis of democracy to understand what's going on in Poland and Hungary, what's going on in in Hong Kong, what's going on in Belarus, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in America. It's not everywhere is having it, by the way. I don't think it's completely universal. It just depends on particular conditions in particular societies at particular points in time. Okay, but because of the crisis of capitalism, the economic crisis of capitalism means that the possibility of a democratic crisis, a possibility of democratic change, is always the kind of political side of an economic crisis of capitalism as well. Okay. Okay, so that's what I wanted to put in as basic the ideas of crisis of democracy and even democratic revolution. So I was now going to go on to my next point, which is this idea of a degenerate social monarchy, this period of time, and ask ourselves what that term means, what it could mean, what we understand by it. So this is the first one. So the first question, I think, is, are we talking about degenerating, meaning a process that's going on, or has it already degenerated? So I don't know the answer to that, by the way. I'm just thinking it's something for us to think about. Are we in the process of, is our social monarchy degenerating, or has it now got to a stage of like degeneration? It's another way of saying it's corrupt or corrupted in a certain sense. Corrupted can mean bribery. There's a lot of bribery going on, but it could mean it's not fit for purpose. If our state is not fit for purpose, then it is corrupted. It's not doing what it should do. It's not looking after the welfare of people. It's becoming immoral towards the people. Now, in other words, degenerating, I think, means like a retardation. So I'm trying to think of some other words to convey this idea. Retardation, going backwards, going in retreat from something. I like Marie's word. I thought of this myself because Marie, in one of her emails, came up with putrefaction, which I was excellent, because it's the idea of the fruit in your fruit bowl. If it keeps going, it will start to putrefy, and then it becomes, you know, no longer fruit. It just goes a mush. So that's a good word, and I like that word. So I just thought I'd nick that one from Marie. And then the other idea, we've got the idea of appearance without substance. In other words, it might still have the Queen, the BBC might still be there, the NHS might still exist, but it's all been hollowed out. It's just like a shell and nothing's happening behind it. If we've got completely generated, we still think it's there, but it isn't really there. It'd be interesting to see, if we looked at the NHS, how much of it is really that. We know the brand's there. What's really happening behind the brand, as it were? You know, that's the point. And hence we're back to the zombies. My zombie film didn't quite work, but look, zombification, that's a process, the living dead, the idea that something has become like a zombie, that it becomes dangerous, and it still looks human, but it isn't really, and it becomes dangerous. I was going to try the next slide if I could. Comrades, let's have a look, see what my next slide is. Where is it? Here we go. I thought I would take a concept that Trotskyists amongst us, or not even if they're not amongst us, would understand, the discussion of the Soviet Union as a degenerated worker state. Okay, because that's using that same concept. It's a really, I'm not totally sure if Trotsky had this theory or whether it was the subsequent Trotskyists that had this theory. And maybe I had time to check that out, but it doesn't really matter for these purposes. It's a theory about the Soviet Union. It's a theory about retardation, like going backwards, that the worker state is going backwards. It's going back from the high point that it was, let's say in 1918 or something like that, going backwards. It is the idea that perhaps it's no longer a worker state, right? Perhaps it isn't a worker state anymore at some point. Or maybe it's got the appearance without the substance, meaning that they sing the Internationale, they fly the red flag, they talk about Marx and Lenin and all these other things, but the substance of it is something else. So that's an idea. So, and in the Soviet Union, we certainly got the growth of bureaucracy, corruption, and those other things. So that's a concept. I just wanted to go outside the concept of degenerated social monarchy to see that this term could be used elsewhere. And of course, the Soviet Union became dangerous to lots of people as well in the 1930s. I won't go down that track particularly. And my next point, trying to keep my eyes out here over the time, degenerating then is an ongoing process. It's like the idea that we're going beyond the point of no return, already beyond repair. And I quite like the idea of Humpty Dumpty. If you know the nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. And that's the idea that we can't really restore it. If we've gone to this point of degeneration, it's gone beyond repair. It can't, all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put it all back together again because it's had a very bad fall. So that speaks to me of the kind of utopian nature of the idea that we can restore the social monarchy because it's beyond repair. It's kind of got to this stage beyond repair. Now we can argue about whether we have reached that stage. I mean, there's an argument to be had. Okay, there's a discussion to be had. And my last point was on this particular point was, therefore, you can see it as a transitional stage. The crisis of democracy is part of that transitional stage. It's not the end of the road, but it's the road. So we're not on the end of any road. We're the road to somewhere else, but we don't know whether somewhere else will be. And I gave a quote from Gramsci that on a previous talk that I gave, which I quite liked it, if I can find it in his prison notebooks that Michael Gove quoted. And he says that the crisis consists precisely of the fact that the inherited is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And Michael Gove talks about the present state by quoting Gramsci. He says, and Gove says, the model of that current generation of political leaders, he's talked about the past, the model that the current generation of political leaders inherited, that's including him, of course, has been crumbling. And now we're in the age, he says, and now we're in the age of morbid symptoms. So that to me is all part of this idea of degeneration. And degeneration is a dangerous process because it can lead to fascism. It can lead to fermenting in this putrefaction, if you like, the fermenting of racism and things of that type, sexism, all sorts of, I won't go into a whole range of different things that can be fermented by the old regime, trying to keep going, trying to divide the opposition. Tsarism famously, when it was putrefying, did pogroms to divide the people. You know, it organized pogroms to do exactly that. So, hold on, where have I got to? Right. Okay, I'm now going to do, my next one is going to go, and this is my sort of, not quite my last section, but let's go on here. Okay, let's just look at this degenerated social. So with these concepts of crisis of democracy, degeneration, I'm now just going to look a little bit at this idea of a degenerated social monarchy. And my first one was to put in a timeline. So here's my timeline in my sort of idea. It sort of begins, the degenerate, it was already in decline under Thatcher and Blair, don't get me wrong, it's been dismantling, it was being dismantled already. So it comes to the banking crisis of 2008, which really blows a hole in the whole thing massively. It blows a hole in neoliberalism. And then the consequence of that is we get austerity, massive austerity, which again is creating a real crisis for many people in the country, and a real alienation. And then it starts to go into, I would say, this crisis of democracy. It begins with I would mark the 2014 Scottish referendum, when 45% of the Scottish people voted to leave the UK. You know, well, I mean, everyone say, well, they did vote to stay, of course, but that, I mean, imagine nearly half the population wants to leave. I mean, what does that say about things? And then we move on to the EU referendum, you know, which Cameron brought in. And again, if we think about that, in England, the majority voted to leave the EU, but that's something to do with this alienation that people felt from the state that's not doing it. It was you can see it as a, albeit misguided. I'm not promoting. I'm not a Brexiteer by that. I'm not saying that, but just saying that the alienation that people felt got found in UKIP, this right wing authoritarian populism that grew up in that period around the EU referendum, right the way through. And then between 2016 to 2019, we got into a constitutional crisis, a proroguing of Parliament, the Supreme Court, all the thing that was going on at the Supreme Court, etc. You know, that the Constitution was coming into play in all this, and could the Parliament, could the Crown get its bill through Parliament under Theresa May, etc., etc. And then we come up to the 2019. Now, in a way, that particular crisis of democracy kind of ended with the general election, but it isn't ended all cold because it's not solved anything. It's just that it seemed to end the Brexit crisis. It seemed to have drawn that to an end because Boris Johnson was going to get Brexit done, etc., and all that sort of stuff. And so then I've got us going into zombie land almost, you know, this sort of other place. And I'm putting the COVID crisis into the mix there as because I'm not going to discuss that today. And I think that I'm going to think we could look at how the COVID crisis illustrates this whole thing that's been if you think it does. Okay, so and just being aware of the time. So that's my sort of timeline. So I could, and I will try to go very quick now, quicker than my PowerPoints, which I will send out to people because I don't want to. I want to get the bit of discussion going. Here's what happens: the Crown, the Treasury of the Bank of England. The Crown is the Treasury of the Bank of England. They abandoned the social monarchy in the 1980s under Thatcher. They bring in privatisation and deregulation. It eventually goes pear-shaped in 2007-8 with the banking crisis. The Treasury and the bank therefore nationalise the banks and their debts. So we have all the banks' debts, billions and billions of pounds goes onto the public purse. And then we have to have austerity. And I saw the term, not neoliberalism, but necroliberalism. And I kind of like that. It does fit. I heard somebody on one of the talks recently mentioned necroliberalism. I'll have one of those. I've nicked Marie's putrefaction, and now I'm going to nick somebody else's necroliberalism for neoliberalism. I have, so that's the whole crisis of austerity. So whipping on from there. I've done that already. Jeremy Corbyn, by the way, I also believe this loss of trust in common. Jeremy Corbyn was also an aspect of the crisis of democracy. It's a whole load of people become dissatisfied with the austerity and the failure of the state. What do? They don't go in for Brexit, they turn to Jeremy Corbyn. So I think the Corbyn movement is also a manifestation of this crisis of democracy. And then you have the EU referendum. So this is a left and right, you know, the left is going one way with it, the right's going in a different way with it. So these are two sides. And then my next one simply says, Brexit broke Britain. I like that. Boris's Brexit broke Britain because he likes to do a lot of alliteration. So Boris's Brexit broke Britain. Northern Ireland, do you remember that Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain? That's a major thing anyway. That suggests a big split in the country. Then England and Wales vote to leave. And Northern Ireland got a special deal, but Scotland didn't get a special deal. Why did Northern Ireland get a special deal? Because they had a Republican movement that they fought the British state to a draw. They got a special deal, which is the Good Friday Agreement. And because of the strength of that Republican movement in the past, historically, Northern Ireland is a rather peculiar special position in this whole story. It's going on today. The Tories are stuck on this. This is the rock upon which their Brexit is going. Bogdanov, Professor Bogdanov says this, and I like this: Brexit is a momentous event, but so far discussion has been almost wholly confined to its economic consequences. Yet Brexit will also affect the way we are governed. It will have fundamental consequences for our politics and constitution. So he's therefore saying, and he's a constitutional expert, thinking that Brexit's broken our old model. So this is part of the degeneration. Brexit is a central breaking point, if you like, on our in this process of degeneration. Where am I getting to now? I'll leave, well, two more, so I'm going to stop them. But here's one, and I tried to put out, and I'm just going out of time. I tried to put out all the different ways in which this degeneration could be looked at. We could look at it in housing, we could look at it in the NHS, we could look in education, racism, energy crisis we've got, the failed state, the productivity stagnated for 10 years, the crisis of democracy, that what's going on in the prisons, and you could add more bubbles, as it were, to this, and we could look at any of those. And one of them I saw, and I'm not going to discuss it now, was this idea of social murder, which Engels talks about in the 19th century, where the state, there's an argument, is it social murder or social killing? It's if people get killed prematurely, die, or because of the negligence of the state, this is a class thing. Now, John MacDonald used the term social murder to describe Grenfell Tower. He said the social murder took place there, that the state didn't care about those people living in that tower. So I think social murder, and when I looked at the Marmot report, and I've got time to do the Marmot report on health, he says that for some people anyway, life expectancy has gone into reverse. It's gone backwards. Now, this to me is degeneration. Okay, so what I'm thinking is that we can get evidence of degeneration if we start looking for it. Productivity, what's going on in the prisons? A terrible situation in the prisons in this country. What's happening in the energy? You know, you could add other bubbles here. This is not an exclusive list of things. I've missed all sorts of stuff out. So if I've missed out one of yours, you're going to forgive me and add it in. So I think that we could all be looking at these different manifestations of degeneration in particular sectors of our society that need to be looked at. The Marmot report is very good on this. When you get into looking at COVID, the fact that people have said COVID was about, I don't want to go into COVID, so I'm trying to steer away from that, and I won't go into that, but we could look at the idea of social murder in relation to COVID as well, but that's for another time. So I'm coming to the end this time. Yes, I had, I've already said that Marmot report. But he talks about England faltering. It's only about England. England's faltering. Austerity has taken its toll in all. I don't even know what that means now, but never mind. I'll finish this. I'll finish this little bit off in review. He gives some, you know, I'll give you the reference to it, and you can read it yourself if you're interested. But it's a very detailed report in 2020, based on evidence they had in 2010, how health conditions in this country have gone backwards in the last 10 or 11 years. And it's got chapter and verse statistics, etc. So this to me is all evidence of what I'm suggesting about the state in which our society currently finds itself, especially he deals with England. I'll put a bit more of that quote in when I do up the PowerPoints. I'm finishing more. I'm coming to the general election, which is where I'm going to finish. So I've come here to say that the degenerated social monarchy is like an empty shell, a mask for the anarchy of crown power. The mask of anarchy, of course, was what Percy Bysshe Shelley talked about, because it was about the idea that the state, the crown, said that the people were anarchists and they were going to have a riot in St. Peter's Square. But in fact, Shelley says, no, what the anarchists were really the state. They attacked people, they disorganized them, they chased them, they beat them, they killed them, etc. So Shelley used the word the mask of anarchy. Behind this mask is something else. So here we have the mask of the social monarchy has become a mask. Behind that is a failed state, a dying state, a zombie state, I would say, is where we're getting towards, to that position. Now I'll come to the general election. So let's see what we have in the general election. This is my very brief take on it, and I'll finish there. Not COVID, it says. They were not doing COVID yet, so we'd follow, because we're only going to end in 2019. So I think I've got something like this. Question is, how can we save or rebuild the British social monarchy? And so we've got Johnson and Corbyn in my view, trying to address the country with the same sort of idea, really, but differently. So Johnson's saying, take back control, get Brexit done, level up. And that's kind of a Tory version of the social monarchy. You know, if we took back control, more democracy, we got Brexit done, we broke away from all this stuff that's killing us off in the EU. And then we leveled up, you know, so everybody's more equal or whatever. That would be it. Well, Corbyn was saying, we're going to end austerity. We're going to renegotiate Brexit, which looked like a lot of dither and delay, and we're going to use public spending against austerity. That's how we're going to resurrect the social monarchy. So they're both doing it. But the thing is, the Corbyn offer, because the Labour Party was so divided, because of anti-Semitism, because Brexit was a kind of mess, political policy mess, it was easy for Johnson to really go, I've got 3 points and everybody understands what they are. What sort of mix up sort of dither and delay have we got over here type of thing? And that's how he was able to do it. So I put, I then went, this is my very final point, by the way. I went to Johnson's speech. Now, I'm not meant to go through them, but I couldn't resist this. I went to King Bozo of Clowning Street, his speech to the 2021 Tory Party conference. So I looked it up and he said 2 things in there. He said a lot more interesting things, by the way, but I'll keep them for next time. He said, we sent the corduroy communist cosmonaut into orbit. Okay, that's Jeremy, of course, obviously, the corduroy communist cosmonaut into orbit. Then he said, and this is my final point, that he talked about there was a Corbynista mob of sellotaped, spectacled, you know, this is a sans-culottes. So Marie will get that one, and I'm sure those of us with a bit of French do will know. Because the sans-culottes, what were they? A mob of radical working class Republicans. So the Tories, Johnson, what he's really scared of is in this little line in his speech somewhere. He's scared of this mob of sans-culottes, this mob of people. Mob, he used the word mob in the emotive sense. You know, the people he's scared of, what you call a mob of Republicans. And so there's a clue in Johnson's speech where we have to go in the face of this crisis. It's not to resurrect Corbynism, it's to work out what these sans-culottes are all about, And so I think that is right. Homework. Okay, I've got homework for you. Here's the homework. 2 questions. Oh no, not that one. Sorry, go back. What happened there? Oh, I missed a little bit. Oh yes, look. Okay, I'm skip this one. This is about in plain sight. I'm going to skip that one. It'll come up next time. We're talking about the attack on democracy by Boris Johnson. There's an article in The Guardian. There's a whole series of things here. We'll talk about it next time. Just leave that there for the minute. It's what's happening now since 2019. In plain sight is rigging the system to stay in power. We will skip over that. It's part of the crisis of democracy and our Tories. So my 2 questions for the final next session is, does the COVID-19 pandemic confirm the theory of degenerated social monarchy? Is there evidence there? And the next one is, how can we kill the zombie before it kills us? That's my last point. What program, what policy we need to kill the zombies before the zombies kill us? And just to wave you on the way, this will be it, and we'll stop. Here comes my final one, which is, there we go, the end, but not quite goodbye. All right, the end, but not quite goodbye. Now, I've raced through that, comrades, so what I will do, just to finish off, to say I will put the PowerPoints together and circulate them so you can come back and stuff. And I see it as a joint project, so I'm throwing out things for you to come back and bring stuff into it as well. You know, we have to, this is an idea that it tells us what direction we should be heading towards. So I will stop there, Carol. I will end the show and I will go back off the stop the screen share.
Right. Well, that's such a good summary of what's actually happened. And you know, the crisis, the financial crisis, the degeneracy of the whole system. It's what happened in 1930s, isn't it? And then we had the rise of fascism. And we're seeing the same thing, aren't we, today? We're seeing exactly the same thing. I mean, Johnson is heading into fascism as far as I'm concerned. And I just, you know, we had that general election 2019, everything could have been stopped. And it wasn't. It's really frightening. Anyway, I'm throwing the discussion open to everybody. I'll work with hands up, and anybody who'd like to comment on that extremely good presentation. Anybody who'd like to add anything or have any questions for Steve, please put your hands up. There's silence. And Jennifer's giving us, would you like to speak, Jennifer? You're just clapping, yeah. Yeah, it was good. And nobody, Mari, would you like to unmute, Mari? You're still muted, is it?
Yeah. Well, I think it was very good. I'm full of it and I don't know anymore what to ask. But somebody talked about assemblies in our group. Somebody talks about citizens' assemblies after the climate change. I don't know whether we could come back on this, because there must be things that we can do, not just look at the zombies, but we have to also, I think perhaps when possible we should start having stalls in the street or wherever, or in conferences with a little banner. We have to start being seen. And I'm full of hope, because what we are posing is not only the necessary thing, it's also the thing that people are going to want. Because if you look in Italy, people go in the streets. In France, people are in the streets. Sometimes it's a right wing, but also it creates counter movements, and the whole of the capitalist world is in turmoil. And I think also in this country, very important, the recent mobilizations to stop the highways, and you know, and then this woman Patel, she said they are criminals. And you know that if you want, in fact, the houses to be insulated, you're a criminal. Isn't that degenerate? Isn't that beyond bounds? Beyond, and etc. So I'll stop here.
Right, Jennifer, you had your hand up next. If you'd like to unmute.
I'm wondering if we can link all this to the crisis of neoliberalism and capitalism. I mean, I think we're watching capitalism in its death throes.
Yeah, very good.
And we can see that it only survives by the intervention of the state, which it professes to despise. But that's how it carries on. Without the state, it couldn't carry on.
And Celia, if you
yeah, just a quick question for Susan. Are you practicing for the revolution?
Oh yes, I was. Right. Okay.
A tricoteuse.
I would definitely say I'm really sorry, Steve. I would take issue with an awful lot from your first diagram. You haven't mentioned the City of London. You haven't mentioned the death hand that is MI5 and MI6 and the establishment, the manipulation, the unholy relationship between the media and MI5 and MI6 to plant stories and to undermine things. And you've conveniently left out all the tax havens, the fact that Cameron's dad, you know, the Atlantic Treaty for Margaret Thatcher that allowed vast amounts of money to just simply leak away from the economy. So we were always broke, which is why they justified austerity. But I think that mostly it's the fact that we have this sort of alleged constitutional monarchy, but we have the Queen and Prince Charles going through every single bill and interfering with it, writing things into it, changing our so-called democrat, you know, the manifesto pledges and the bills, and constantly interfering with what's going on. But the other thing is we have social media. We have people like Zuckerberg. You've got Nick Clegg, you know, in on making, you know, interfering with the social media, which was vastly right-wing for the 2017 and 2019 elections. You had Starmer collaborating with May and then with Boris Johnson quite clearly to undermine the election from the inside. So I'm afraid I'd probably turn yours upside down, and I'm sorry to wade in, but I feel like we think of democracy like a swan, and we don't look at the feet underneath that are, you know, madly swimming underneath and completely pushing us into anarchy. And the flirtation of the right, the Tories, with the far right, you know, I mean, Brexit election, they stood in all the seats, stood against Labour, and as soon as there was any risk of upsetting the election, they promptly folded in Tory seats where they might have taken away votes. There was collaboration that there never was. The collaboration on the left was all about Starmer and his mates collaborating with Boris Johnson.
Okay, Susan, I'm going to have to stop you there because George had his hand up for ages.
Oh, I'm so sorry, George.
And the time is 9:15 now, and Steve was talking about having that little extra discussion. So if we can go to George briefly, and I think we're going to have to pull this together and go into that extra that meeting that we need to have after this. Okay, George,
right.
Over to you.
I think the last, first of all, thanks, Steve, for that excellent expose of the degenerate state. The last few points made me think that our role, we're going to be the gravediggers of capitalism and also the degenerate monarchy.
We're going to have to be.
Also, I think we need to, coupled with this, we need to think about, first of all, how we're going to present these ideas more widely. And secondly, present these ideas to the rest of the Labour Party and the left. Two things. So that's all I want to say. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, George. Yes, what you're saying is very important. How to present this, you know, to the rest of the Labour Party. That's really, really important. Okay, Steve, over to you to round up.
Thanks, comrades. Obviously, all I really want to say is that we're going to have to tie it all together programmatically to a policy point, and I really think that's what the last session I'm hoping we'll be able to do, because a lot of things didn't get discussed in this session. I mean, what I would say, of course, is that we've discussed, in a sense, the Crown and the Treasury and the City on other occasions. It's obviously didn't come central to this. We were explaining a particular the process of degeneration, but it's absolutely true that the Crown state at the core of the Crown state is not the Queen, but actually it's the Treasury. And the Treasury is connected to the Bank of England. And the Bank of England is connected to the City of London. So in a sense, the Crown is not the Queen, it's the City of London in government. We have the government of the city, by the city, for the city. But the Crown, by dressing the Crown up as the Queen, and everybody thinking that's what we're actually talking about, then they're into a great game of distraction to direct our attention away from that. So I didn't get into, you're right to sort of to suggest I didn't really go into that, but it's not missing from the analysis. It's just that in this particular talk, I didn't really focus myself on the Crown. We've kind of accepted that from sort of previous discussions. Tax havens, you're absolutely right. I didn't mention tax havens, but you're absolutely right in the bigger picture of that. And quite a few other things I didn't mention, but tax havens are connected to the city. The reason we have these tax havens is because the city and the Crown facilitates this and protects these tax havens, so that the city is the biggest money laundering outfit in the world, laundering money, avoiding taxation. So that's obviously also part of this. Obviously, it didn't figure what I see. You right say pick it up, but it's part of the analysis. It's part of the analysis that we're making. It's part of the analysis to convince the rest of the left that we're talking about. We're not talking about the Queen. We're talking about a major institution, the Crown, a corporate body, where Johnson is the chief executive, and the ministers of the Crown have all the powers, and they're gaining more powers as they go. So, you know, that's, and the social monarchy is merely another mask that they've worn for the last few decades, which they've decided to ditch, and with terrible consequences then for people in all the different ways, including, you know, this idea of social murder and things of that type. So, yeah, we are Republicans. We want to get rid of the Crown. We understand, of course, that the Queen's important in all that. It's not we're dismissing the Queen by saying she's not the same as the Crown. The Crown needs a Queen. You know, the Queen protects the Crown protects the Queen. That's how it works. So, but we mustn't mix the two up. I'm just saying what else. George, I agree. Yeah, we've got to find our ways of presenting. And I think it's programmatic. What are we actually going to say? Because we didn't, for example, talk about the Union or Scotland very much, only got mentioned once, or Wales or Northern Ireland. They got a little mention in this story. That's got to be part of what we're doing. Oh, also citizens' assemblies. I think Marie mentioned citizens' assemblies. You're right. There is our idea of republicanism has to be that republicanism comes from below, from the people organizing themselves. It's not about who is the head of state as such. And so a sign of a crisis of democracy is that people will throw up assemblies. People will start thinking, and this has started to happen. This word citizens' assemblies has just now started to enter in the last few years into the sort of general discussion. Climate change, let's have a citizen assembly. Austerity, let's have another citizens assembly on that, and so on and so forth. So that to me is the beginning of republicanism from below. So, you know, we are in favor of citizens getting together, discussing these problems and acting politically together. So citizens assembly should be part of our approach, our idea of republicanism. Absolutely, it should. I'm just looking, is there anything else? Crisis of somebody said a crisis. Yeah, the crisis of neoliberalism. Well, in a way, the crisis of neoliberalism becomes the crisis of democracy, really. It's neoliberalism. It's what neoliberalism has done to our social fabric that has alienated people. And then they've turned towards thinking, why isn't the government doing something? Why can't it do something? So it turns political. It starts economic and it becomes, as the crisis develops, something political. So to me, the crisis of neoliberalism and the crisis of democracy are sort of go together. They're one's the political side of the economic problem that we face. And neoliberalism, of course, is only a subcategory of capitalism anyway, you know, so we can go from neoliberalism to various forms of capitalism. So I think that's what we need to do. The problem with most of the left, as I would say, is that they, and I'll finish on this point, they talk about neoliberalism, they talk about austerity, but they don't go to the political side of it. They don't get to thinking about what this means in terms of democracy. And then that's where we have to come in. Politics is really important and we have to bring that in.
has summarised very nicely for us. I think we need to bring it to a close, bring this meeting to a close.